Thank you. It is fabulous to be here. I mean, it's Paris, and it's the only day it's rained so far. I want to thank Julie, Katie, everyone at the Terra, everyone at the Fondation Custodia for putting this conference together, and also to thank Stephen and Catherine for having done this ambitious, smart show and letting me be a part of it. All of that, thank you. That's all about success, but what I'm actually going to talk about today is failure, because if we're going to talk about collaboration, failure is a huge piece of it. So, I'm going to talk about the 1970 Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. And the Biennale, as you all probably know, is a show that critics love to hate. But even given that's the case, Gregory Batcock's comments on the 1970 iteration were pretty harsh. The naive, know-nothing exhibition in the American Pavilion is quite simply humiliating. The kindest thing the art public can do at this stage of the game is to stay away. The most intelligent thing to do would be to burn it down. Batcock wasn't alone. The entire 1970 Biennale was widely seen as a disappointment, but the US Pavilion came in for special derision. It was a dramatic departure from the standard recipe of heroic paintings and sculptures devoted to winning awards and burnishing national prestige. It had been designed as both an exhibition and a working print studio, and it should have been the crowning glory of this decade of American printmaking in the 1960s, in which American art moved to the global center of the art world and printmaking moved to the center of American art. American art, as we've discussed and as Laurence explained so beautifully, together with the American print workshops that were founded at the beginning of that decade, had changed the way that art was made and thought about. We've dispensed with the Hans Nama famous photographs of Jackson Pollock alone in his barn flinging paint with his demons as a paradigm for the way art was made, and we've moved on to Robert Rauschenberg at Gemini, surrounded by technicians and machines. Art making became a team event, publicly acknowledged as such. And this had happened through this confluence of personalities and ambitions. On the one hand, you had younger artists who were turning away from the subjectivity that had dominated the avant-garde since the mid-19th century. Many of them were interested in multiplicity. Many of them were interested in the social positioning of art. Many of them were interested in what it means to live in a world that is saturated with reproduction. Many of them were interested in the inverses and cognitive complexity of print logic. At the same time, we had a number of print workshops that were established by people, and this is really critical, who had no qualifications to do so. Before founding Tamarind, June Wayne was an artist. Before founding ULAE, Tatiana Grossman was an artist's wife. They benefited from what Wayne called the advantage of a short tradition, as did the artists they chose to work with, many of whom had never made a print before. So a slight detour here. The American critic Harold Rosenberg drew this distinction between what he saw as the orderly, principle-driven trajectory of art history in Europe and this kind of freewheeling pragmatism that he saw as intrinsically American. And he decided to go for a military metaphor, and using the War of Independence as his reference point, he dubbed the European model redcoats and the American model coonskins. The new print shops were pure coonskin. The artist's ignorance of how a print was supposed to be made became the prompt for printers, who were usually artists themselves, to figure out how it could be made. What the master printer had to offer, as New York Times critic John Russell, was not printmaking in the old sense. It was printmaking as metamorphosis, and it was irresistible. It was this subject, not just the art made, but the dynamic improvisational process that made it, that was supposed to be the subject of the 1970 American Pavilion. The prints that were going to be on view would cover a wide range of style. There was pop, minimalism, op, figuration, basically everything you've got downstairs pre-1970. And it would also have this on-site lithography and screen print workshops where what the organizers thought was that it would lay a foundation, this is their words, for breaking away from national presentations, developing truly international projects and workshops sponsored by groups of collaborating nations. It was supposed to showcase an American innovation, the collaborative experimental fine print workshop, while being interactive, international, and intercultural. These days, for those of you who get lots of press releases, you will know that these are still the buzzwords that lard every forward-thinking exhibition, including many of the national pavilions at the Biennale. These are still seen as progressive, positive ideals characteristic of serious art. So, what went wrong? The answer is a tangle of domestic politics, foreign policy imbroglios, and cultural zeitgeist, but it is also tied to how we think about and what we expect from this mercurial activity of collaboration. So to understand what happened, it helps to know something about the U.S. Pavilion itself, including the fact that it is not owned by the United States of America. Most of the Biennale pavilions, as you undoubtedly know, are run by national governments and their cultural ministries, but we're American, we don't do cultural ministries, we do cultural entrepreneurship. So the U.S. Pavilion was built in 1930 by Grand Central Art Galleries of New York City, and in 1954 it was sold to another private entity, the Museum of Modern Art. And in the immediate post-war period, MoMA had been particularly active among the organizations that were promoting what in America was a new idea of state support for the arts, and especially for state support for traveling American art abroad, precisely what the Terra does today. Americans in the cultural sector were very aware that the nation was kind of viewed as a powerful oaf. It was rich and mighty, but perhaps lacking in cultural sophistication. And as the Cold War took hold, MoMA and other organizations made the argument that American art was a necessary ambassador for the nation's democratic and capitalist ideals. David Scott, director of the Smithsonian's National Collection of Fine Arts, put it this way in the 60s: Western Europe will not completely trust the United States as the leader of the Western Alliance until it is offered convincing proof of America's cultural maturity. So international art exhibitions were promoted as being both culturally valuable and as instruments of geopolitics. And the result of this campaign was a series of kind of uneasy alliances between privately funded museums, the State Department, and the United States Information Agency, or USIA, whose job it was to promote American values and viewpoints to non-American audiences. Cynics called this propaganda. Today we would probably call it branding. USIA's primary vehicle was radio, but it also had a division for fine art exhibitions, which was headed by a woman named Lois Bingham. And Lois Bingham was very concerned with keeping the art they showed non-political, and she was a tremendous promoter of American abstract painting in the 1950s, when a lot of conservative politicians in America remained convinced that abstraction was a communist conspiracy to degrade the American character. She argued to the contrary, that American avant-garde art was in fact material evidence of the freedom of expression and liberty of mind that America embodied. So you have this kind of complex thing, which is, yes, it's being used to promote the idea of America as this kind of ideological haven, but what's promoting it is exactly the fact that the art is not visibly political. So it's somewhat counterintuitive. USIA organized a whole wide variety of exhibitions. They did folk art, they did poster design, they did ceramics, but Bingham noted that the most significant single aspect of the entire program is the United States representation at the two great international biennial exhibitions, Venice and Sao Paulo. In 1964, MoMA handed over the running of the Biennale Pavilion to the USIA. Bingham hired curator Alan Solomon to put together a showcase of younger American artists, including Jim Dine, Jasper Johns, Claes Oldenburg, Frank Stella, and Robert Rauschenberg. That's the exhibition. The public either loved it or hated it. The French press mainly hated it. But Rauschenberg walked away with the painting prize, and the win was a vindication for Bingham, as she said, reinforcing the image of the United States as the cultural and intellectual leader of the Western world. I imagine that quote was probably not made to the French press. Rauschenberg's first international triumph, however, had occurred the year before when he took first prize at the Ljubljana Graphic Biennial with our good friend Accident. And for people who don't know the story behind this print, what happened is he was working at ULAE, which was at that point they'd been publishing for 3 years. He was working on a large stone, ran it through the press, the stone broke. Took another large stone, recreated the composition, ran it through the press, the stone broke. At that point, he decided to print from the broken stone, and the printer's jury-rigged wooden contraption on the press bed to hold the bits in place while they printed from it. He added a little bit of twee rubble at the bottom. And the thing is that if the American printers had been more experienced, if they'd come up through, say, the apprenticeship system that you had in France, chances are those stones never would have broken. On the other hand, chances are they might have drawn the line at printing from broken stones, which could have damaged the press, which could have done all sorts of things. So Accident became this kind of marker. It's important as a work of art in its own right. It's important as a historical marker of a moment, and it's also important as this kind of icon of seat-of-the-pants art making. Throughout the 1960s, young printers, most of them trained at Tamarind, spread out across the country, setting up new print shops and bringing in painters like Rauschenberg to make experimental, adventurous prints. At the same time, the expansion of American higher education with the GI Bill led to the establishment of printmaking as an academic discipline, which it hadn't really been before. And you had all these universities and art schools starting printmaking departments. These really kind of operated as two separate worlds. The academic departments were run by people who were dedicated printmakers, many of whom had trained with Stanley William Hayter. Most of them did intaglio primarily or exclusively. The collaborative workshops were mainly run by lithographers who worked with a wide variety of artists on images that developed with input from both parties. Bingham at USIA and later at the Smithsonian made use of all of this. Prints are really convenient objects if you're looking to send exhibitions traveling around the world. They're lightweight, they're easy to hang, they're cheap to acquire comparatively. And USIA and Smithsonian put together dozens of shows with titles like Contemporary American Prints, American Intaglios, Contemporary Lithographs from the United States. And these shows sent thousands and thousands of prints on multi-year tours of Europe, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, and the Antipodes. In Brussels, one of these print exhibitions attracted 20,000 visitors, and in the winter of 1963, as you can tell from the photograph, Muscovites stood on these long queues to see this exhibition, Graphic Arts USA. Despite these successes, USIA remained very suspicious of. They were afraid that contemporary art was inherently controversial and that it was going to get them in trouble with Congress and it was going to get their funding yanked. So in 1967, I believe, 65, they transferred the program with Bingham still in charge over to the Smithsonian. the mission remained the same. The equation of personal expression equals freedom equals capitalism was never entirely absent from their aims and ambitions, nor was this kind of woolly overlap between governmental initiatives and private enterprise. One venture that's relevant to this show is the 11 pop artists' portfolios. These were 3 portfolios that included all the major pop artists. They were screen printed, and they were published by the Philip Morris Tobacco Company with the express purpose of touring them by the USIA. This was a project cooked up by Philip Morris's PR firm in the wake of findings linking cigarettes and lung cancer. It would make Philip Morris look hip. It would make them look patriotic. It would be a win for everybody. And these things traveled widely around the world, simultaneously promoting new American art and Philip Morris cigarettes. So as the print boom of the 1960s gained momentum, Bingham and her colleagues came to realize that in addition to the prints themselves, the collaborative paradigm developed in the American workshops could also be exported as this kind of exemplar of American values. So in cooperation with Pratt Graphics Center in New York, they launched a series of workshops called Creative Printmaking in Action, in which the Smithsonian described as a means of exploring with foreign artists the recently developed possibilities of an art form with which many are not familiar. American printmakers would establish a working environment where artists are stimulated to experiment and where a genuine exchange of ideas is the inevitable result. In Karachi, a local USIS officer wrote that his post had, this is a quote, never had a project which reached as significant a segment of the artistic community as deeply and effectively as the print workshop. And so this print workshop project then, it went from Karachi to Iran to Lebanon to Jordan to Turkey, all within about 2 years between 67, 69. And by that time, in world history, it was getting harder to project a simply positive image of the United States. There was growing displeasure with the post-war world order and growing opposition to American economic dominance, cultural ubiquity, and military adventurism. For Bingham and her crew, the programming of the great international biennial exhibitions was becoming increasingly fraught. In the troubled summer of 1968, the Venice Biennale, public spectacles celebrating national identities and the visible movement of capital, was an obvious target. Attacking what they termed a fascist capitalist commercial art show, students mounted protests against the Italian government, the American government, the monetization of art, bourgeois values in general. Jurors resigned, artists withdrew, 1,200 police swarmed the grounds of the Biennale. The following year in Sao Paulo, Brazilian artists opposed to the military junta then in power called on their international colleagues to boycott the show. The American plan had been for an interactive exhibition of experimental technological art, but it was scrapped by the curator, Georgi Kepes, when several artists involved withdrew in consort with their Brazilian peers. So heading into the 1970 Biennale, Bingham and her team had the unenviable task of engineering an exhibition that would A, diffuse anti-Americanism, B, not antagonize conservative American politicians, C, earn the respect of the European art world, and D, present a generous view of the United States as a place of openness and experimentation. It is probably not surprising that they turned to the exhibition plus workshop format that had been so successful in Karachi. With curator Henry Hopkins, they developed a group exhibition of 94 prints by 47 artists, including such big names as Warhol, Rauschenberg, Johns, Rachets, and Dine, as well as academic printmakers such as Mauricio Lazansky and Gabor Peterdy. These were what Hopkins termed educative tools, but the real meaningful part of the program, he argued, lay in the creative interaction of the workshops. Obviously, he wrote, the results of this interaction are not predictable, yet it is our hope that it will open new avenues of approach and communication. Printmakers from the University of Wisconsin were hired to be in residence for the full summer as artist professors. William Weege would handle screen printing and Jack Dammer would head lithography. Over the course of short residencies, they would collaborate with invited artists from around the world. The emphasis would be on the experimental approach to printmaking techniques rather than on the production of large quantities of prints. The environment should foster both individual inventiveness among artists and creative communication, bringing together people of widely varied ages, experience, and national origins. Much of the one-on-one work would take place in the former U.S. consulate on the Grand Canal, which is away from the Biennale itself, but there would also be public demonstrations and interactive events at the pavilion itself, where a long brick wall was replaced with glass so that passers-by could see real art being made in real time. The result of the longer collaborative residencies would then be put on view in a series of one-person exhibitions in the pavilion. All this sounds great. But on April 30th, Richard Nixon went on television to announce that American forces had invaded Cambodia, expanding the war in Indochina and setting off a fresh wave of anti-war protests. 4 days later, at Kent State University in Ohio, National Guard troops opened fire on student demonstrators, killing 4 and wounding 9. In the resulting furor, a group of New York artists convened an emergency cultural government whose stated aim was to supplant the U.S. government in all its activities as the sponsor of American art abroad. 2 of its leaders, Robert Morris and Frank Stella, had been due to participate in the Biennale. They urged all the included artists to refuse to allow their work to be used as what they termed a cultural veneer to cover policies of ruthless aggression abroad and intolerable repression at home. On the 5th of June, they sent a telegram to Bingham announcing that 20 artists selected to show in the American Pavilion at this year's Venice Biennale have withdrawn their work. Now remember that the Biennale opens in the 3rd week of June, so this is June 5. She wrote back to each of the artists individually, arguing that the show's experimental collaborative structure would contribute to the international understanding and respect which are essential to any semblance of world peace, and made the point that she was against politicizing art and that they were politicizing art. In the end, 24 artists withdrew, including most of the best known: Dine, Lichtenstein, Motherwell, Oldenburg, Rauschenberg, Stella, Warhol. On a 15 June press conference, from Joshua C. Taylor, director of the Smithsonian, he acknowledged that some artists whose works were selected for exhibition are seriously perturbed by social and political situations at home and abroad and have asked that their work not be shown. We are in sympathy with the seriousness of their concern and respect their action, even though we regret it. And throughout, the organizers actually they posted a statement to this effect on the pavilion, explaining the reasons why the artists had withdrawn. So there really wasn't this kind of animosity or backlash that one might imagine under the circumstances. On the 24th, when the Biennale opened to the public, it had lost 2/3 of the exhibition works and most of the artists who were scheduled for residency workshops and one-person events. The Los Angeles Times critic Henry Seldes wrote that sealed crates full of prints were still standing in front of the former consulate. Seldes saw the withdrawals as pointless grandstanding and raised complaints echoed by several sources of last-minute arm-twisting by the Emergency Cultural Government Committee. And he singled out a portfolio that was on view. That's the withdrawals. This is the portfolio he singled out. Peace is Patriotic by William Weege as an example of the most meaningful protest he felt American artists could make. He also pointed out that the exhibition still included such luminaries as Albers, Johns, and Rauschets, and he concluded, there is every reason to believe that the American artists who will participate in the Biennale print workshop throughout the summer will not only have ample opportunity to make their Italian counterparts understand the depth and strength of protests against war, violence, and racism that exists among American artists, but that they will also produce works that symbolize this attitude. Their own contribution to a better America will be greater than any of the artists who choose withdrawal. But for those who chose to remain in Venice, the problems went beyond politics. The whole Biennale suffered from parodic levels of disorganization. Even after the show opened to the public, the New York Times reported that carpenters were still working to get the showrooms in order, artists were still waiting for power sources for their works, and nothing had been installed in the Italian Pavilion. The American workshops faced further challenges when the presses and materials were detained at customs. Some of the presses were damaged in shipping. Because of U.S. government funding calendars, workshop leaders had no money to buy paper and ink for several weeks. And on sunny days, those floor-to-ceiling glass windows installed to open the pavilion up to public view turned the workshop into a sauna. Furthermore, several of the international invitees were asked for political reasons rather than artistic merit or even artistic interest. And in one case, Washington managed to schedule an artist to arrive after all the professor artists had returned to the United States for the beginning of the fall term. So there were a lot of logistical problems. And yet, in terms of the international creative communication that Hopkins and Bingham laid out as their goal, there were actually a large number of successes. To solve the problem of the missing presses, the Americans made contact with Walter Rossi's workshop 2RC in Rome, which loaned presses and sent printers up to work with their American colleagues. The Americans went down to Rome. There were these lasting bonds and trading of information and techniques, so on and so forth, exactly what the program was supposed to produce. When the heat made working in the glass-fronted workshop impossible, Weege moved the screen print operation into the courtyard, where he made and distributed prints, some of which called for Richard Nixon's impeachment. He got a little verbal slap on the wrist from Bingham, but nothing more than that. Meanwhile, at the abandoned consulate, the participants and organizers lived together in what Hopkins described as a tail end of the love-in era kind of commune, with presses and artists at work, and seemingly had a perfectly nice time. For some, the experience was transformative. Bud Shark had been a student at Tamarind when he was tapped at the last minute to go to Venice as an artist printer because of all of the other withdrawals. He was a North Dakotan who had never been abroad in his life, and he cut his teeth working with a mixed bag of artists in chaotic circumstances and ended up with a one-man show in the Venice Biennale at the age of 24. After Venice, he went to London, where he printed for Petersburg Press for many years, then to Colorado, where he founded one of America's foremost lithographic workshops, still going strong. Certainly, the most spectacular bit of Coonskinism was Ed Ruscha's chocolate room. So Rauchet had been scheduled for the very first residency. So he arrives, there are no presses, there's no paper, there's no ink, there's missing 2/3 of the artists. So he and the print publisher Brooke Alexander roamed around Venice collecting Nestle squeezable tube chocolate. He had been working with foodstuffs. He just started working with foodstuffs the previous year in the Stains portfolio and the Muse Brews portfolio, and this was something he was interested in. And so they took this chocolate, they screen printed it onto all those sheets of paper. You've seen this slide. The idea was that it should look like the shingles of a California bungalow on the exterior. And this was a room, just think this through, this was a room covered in chocolate in Italy in the summer, okay? So, everyone recalls that the smell, the heat, and the humidity were overwhelming, and visitors very, very quickly realized that they could draw and write messages in the chocolate with their fingers, and then the bugs arrived. So the chocolate room became a legend. I remember hearing about it as a student. It was this, kind of, it was up for 1 month, and then it came down and never to be seen again until 2004, when Rachets recreated the piece and sold it to LA MoCA, who now owns it, and this is the installation at LA MoCA. Meanwhile, in New York, a planned anti-biennale of work by the withdrawn artists was derailed by infighting, and many of the loaned works were kidnapped from storage to return them to the owners. Of the eventual exhibitions, the New York Times wrote, "The resulting potpourri, its professionalism hopelessly diluted by a plethora of propaganda posters, political rhetoric, slapdash invective, and some raw amateur work, is one of the most unrewarding art exhibitions of this or any season." So it didn't make out any better. Would things have been different if those 24 artists had not withdrawn? Certainly the exhibition component would have been more compelling. There's widespread agreement that, with the exception of the chocolate room, the art produced at the workshops that summer was unremarkable, and the portfolio made there for touring through the USIA seems to have found few takers. This isn't necessarily surprising. The archives of even the most celebrated workshops reveal the enormous amount of time and resources that can be spent on projects that are never completed to anyone's satisfaction. And that's among studios that get to pick their own artists and work with them for decades. In any case, Hopkins and Bingham had been clear that the pictures on the wall were supposed to be of secondary importance to the social interaction, what we would now call relational aesthetics. This social interaction worked well in the context of the creative printmaking and action workshops, and in fact, those projects continued to travel for several years after the Venice debacle. They expanded from the Middle East, they were in Europe, they were in Asia, and they were in Africa. But the Biennale is first and foremost a spectacle, and the process of collaborative printmaking is rarely spectacular. It consists of people sitting around cleaning things, mixing chemicals, sitting around and looking at things, sitting around and drawing, and sitting around and having private conversations, very, very occasionally pulling something from a press. And in any case, in Venice, most of that activity took place behind closed doors at the abandoned consulate. So, though collaboration has become a byword by itself, this kind of all-purpose panacea for creative malaise and political anxieties, it's as mercurial and elusive as any other means of invention. In any case, collaborative working methods were an important development in American art because of the art they produced, not for their independent status as a set of behaviors. The 60s sentiment of "it's the journey, not the destination" doesn't really hold in the mainstream art world, where people still expect things to look at. So left to deal only with the byproducts of that journey, Babcock and other observers couldn't see the project itself, because, as Bud Sharp wrote to Lois Bingham after the event, we were the project. So one final word, which is, it's very hard to find any information. There's been very little published about this because everybody was so embarrassed afterwards. They never even did the report that is like the standard thing. But the Terra has actually funded a young scholar named Jennifer Noonan to work in the Smithsonian archives, and she is doing the primary research to pull all this together, what actually happened, where the art is, what all these pieces are, and is hopefully publishing a book at some point on this. So look out for that. Thank you.